Okay, welcome everybody. Good morning.
Shalom, Melton.
See everybody.
Melton, can you hear us? Said mute.
I feel like it's like seeing a celebrity because I'm only used to seeing you on the stage.
For the holiday, I will sign an autograph.
Great, what'd you say? Great to see everybody. Welcome.
It's nice to see you have legs and.
If you're joining on Zoom, the sheet should be on the website. If you go to Adult Learning or Torah Cafe, wherever, there should be a link to the source sheet. But I'm sorry that it wasn't sent out. That's on me, as it typically is. I don't get it in on time and then it doesn't go out on the email. But hopefully you can access it there. So what I wanted to talk about today, we get a few interesting things in this week's Parsha. And I think there's sort of an interesting way to connect all the disparate components. Because we have, on one hand, there are the different roles for the different Levite groups, right? They get special roles in the sanctuary. They hold the sacred objects. Okay, so that's one part. What do you got?
Big roll, small roll, solid roll.
Oh, the role, big role. Yeah. Okay.
Well, last week or maybe the week before, we read about the census. Each tribe has about 30,000 to 70,000. So I imagine the Levites must be similar.
Yeah.
So there might be a lot of roles to hang out to distribute for 30,000 people.
Yeah.
There were 231 too few Levites, wasn't it, or some such number?
I'm not sure I have to do that. You're
It's something that.
Numbers are irrelevant in this. Wait. Okay, so let me clarify. Not red.
How could numbers be irrelevant?
I'm kidding. That's the joke. Mount red roles, they all get secret jobs, okay? And then, so they carry the ritual object. That's one part of this parsha, not so. Then you get, there is the census part, but then you get the law of the Nazarites, right? If somebody wants to basically become a Jewish monk, here are the ways that they do that. They grow out their hair, they abstain from wine and grape products. Okay, so we have Levites get elevated. Nazarite is an opportunity to become, anybody can be a monk. And then you have sota, not the bubbly cola drink, but this. Well, I thought if you rolls were bread rolls, I knew that make there it's not carbonated drink. So the sota ritual is if a jealous husband suspects that his wife has been unfaithful, then there is a ritual whereby God basically miraculously intervenes to determine whether or not, to determine the truth. What you do is you bring her to the priest and you make this concoction that includes dust from the tabernacle, from this portable sanctuary, and she drinks it. And if she's guilty, if she then her belly will swell, her thigh will sag. There's a whole thing that happens. But if not, she's exonerated. Nothing will happen, and it's the husband who's guilty for having accused her. Well, no, it's interesting. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai eventually does away with it. And the reason is he says that adultery has become so rampant, it's such a regular part of human experience that we can't actually have a test to test the woman, because it only works if you assume that the male is faultless. It only works if you assume that because if he is also, suspected of being unfaithful, then it's an unfair, and it's also unfair to have God perform all these miracles all the time. So he does away with it because it was no longer an exception to the rule, unfortunately.
So what would happen to the relationship if the woman would be found guilty? Would that be the end of the relationship?
Yes,
What
well,
would
it's
actually?
severe. It's severe because thou shalt not commit adultery, so it leads to death. Right?
Stoning.
Yeah, she would die. Yes.
Anyone ever a Nazarite? I know Samson, there was food, but they were dedicated by their parents in the womb. Did anybody actually take the vow?
That's a great question. I'd have to think about it. I mean, presumably, yes, but I don't know that we get any examples. So I'd actually have to scour the literature to try to find examples, but, it's a great point. Certainly we don't hear of many. Samson being the most famous, Samuel, right? His mom, Hannah says, God, if you give me a son, I will dedicate him. Basically make him a Nazarite. Yeah. So there are those examples, but I don't know how widespread it was, but,
Not covered over social security.
not covered over Social Security, Jackie said.
And you know, Rabbi,
Yeah.
it has always fascinated me in the Torah that they make a point to say men and women
Yeah,
can become Nazarites.
well, good. So
And
this is
I've
exactly,
always thought that was fascinating. So I have a feeling, Nelson, that there probably were.
I would think so. And so you might ask, what is the thread that ties all of these things together? Because they seem that which we're going one direction and another direction, and
Yeah.
they're disparate
Separation.
components. Separation, that's interesting. Rabbi Sachs has an article and
Because
he,
you didn't bring up,
You love.
the other couple examples yet.
from not so other things that go
Yeah.
on. Go ahead.
Two
fill in the
chapters
blank.
worth. What's the,
There's the offering that everybody gives. So everybody, all of the tribes give the same exact offering for the dedication of the tabernacle. And you might ask, well, why do it was so repetitive? And the Torah, which is so economical about its words, right? It doesn't, it's not redundant, right? Everything has to have meaning.
it's one was Mitzvah, one was Nazarite.
Yes, that's right. It starts with sending a leper out.
I
Yeah,
can't remember what the other two are.
yeah, good. Well, we
There's
basically,
four of them in this two chapters.
yeah, good. So right, all these
About
different pieces.
separation.
Good. So separation is is a wonderful answer. Rabbi Sachs goes a different direction with it. He goes with jealousy. He says all of these sort of are meant to mitigate or combat jealousy among the Israelites. So let's go back. Number one, elevating the Levites. The Levites were jealous or would have been jealous of the Kohanim, of the priests, that they have this special role. So God gives the Levites a special role as well to elevate them. Okay, so that mitigates jealousy there.
There's another possible jealousy.
Go ahead.
All the other tribes get land,
All the other tribes, what?
get land.
Get land, right? You're
In an
supposed to.
agrarian society,
Good.
that's. the
Levites
most
should be
important.
elevated because Levites
well.
don't get a special inheritance. You're supposed to carve out some land for the Levite, all the tribes who get a land inheritance. Good.
God didn't intend for that to happen.
It was definitely intentional. Right, it wasn't, God didn't neglect them. It was on purpose, by design. But it's like God is their inheritance, right? And all the more so if they have an actual, not bread roll. Okay, so that's that. And then with the Nazarite, the jealousy being mitigated there is that anybody could be close to God through this process of becoming a monk. So you might say, well, what if I'm not a Levite? What if I'm not a Kohen?
But in being closer to God, he's separating himself from the rest of the people.
Exactly, so the
why I
separation
said
being,
that.
yeah, and it's Kedusha. Kodesh means holy, but it also means set apart, sacred. So to embark on this sacred path of being a Nazarite, it's setting yourself apart, so absolutely. But good, so that mitigates jealousy there. Sota is obvious, right? Because what do you do with jealousy within a home between husband and wife, right? So God is gonna have this ritual to mitigate the jealousy by having a miracle to find the truth. And then finally, at the end, when they give all of the tribes giving the same exact offering, think back to Cain and Abel, the original lethal jealousy that led to the first fratricide because God preferred one offering over the other. So look at this arc of development, of evolution, where now 12 tribes coming from 12 brothers who were jealous, 11 brothers who were jealous of Joseph. Right now, the tribes are all coming together in a moment of perfect equality and no jealousy or competition. We're all going to offer the same, to the point where the Torah doesn't just say they all offered, 12 silver basins. It says, and the offering of the tribe of Levi was, and the offering of tribe of Issachar was. It goes for paragraphs and paragraphs. So the point where I think this is the 271, I think, verses in this.
176.
176. It's not too.
That's the number I remember.
And it
Okay, let's
gives
go
us
with that.
something to read.
176, right? So I think it's one of the longest, it's not the longest, right?
It's the lawn.
So you didn't, if you don't need to do that, but the Torah does it as if to say like, there should be no jealousy. Okay, so that's just a little bit of framing, but I want to dive into one ritual and one component, one piece in particular, and that's sota. Because I think it's just so interesting. So we're gonna dive
While
into
you're
that.
diving into that, one of the things you put into this drink is the dirt from around
The tabernacle, yeah.
isn't that where they sprayed, sprinkled all the blood? So wouldn't the blood be in that dirt?
Oh, that's interesting. Right, when you do the offering, and you do shofar, you're supposed to cover up the blood. So maybe we're eating blood that way. Very interesting. I haven't thought of that. I mean,
I just thought of that when I read this before.
I would assume, yeah,
Hmm.
that's interesting. I would assume that they're taking the dirt from not around the base of the altar, so that it's not
That's what it said.
from the base of the altar. Let's go ahead and read. Who wants to read from our first text? This is gonna be about the sota ritual. Any volunteers?
The priest shall take sackful water in an earthen vessel, and taking some of the earth that is on the floor of the tabernacle, the priest shall put it into the water. After he has made the woman stand before God, the priest shall bear the woman's head and place upon her hands the meal offering of remembrance, which is a meal offering of jealousy. And in the priest's hands shall be the water of bitterness that induces the spell. The priest shall put these curses in writing and rub it off into the bitter water.
Okay, so first let's just have some basic impressions. What do you make of the sota ritual? And then I want to hone in on one piece of the ritual itself. Sounds like a witch doctor or a witch.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Very unsanitary. Right. Right, you get a stomachache no matter what. It's kind of an unfair trial. But I think there was something I was reading about how other cultures that had a similar kind of like ritual for a suspected adulteress. It was actually more severe, what they might have to imbibe or whatever. So this actually was mild in terms, a little bit of dirt, a little bit of ink. It's not great, but it's not gonna kill you kind of.
He just took almost everything that came from other cultures and
There's a lot of influence, yeah.
but I guess that's why we do these things in court. It's where we have the idea to do them. But you know, just watch the progression of prayer, progression of punishment.
Mhm. Yeah, well, it's always interesting to note that the similarities between cultures, and then it's all the more interesting to note the way in which Judaism departs from those. So for instance, like with the Epic of Gilgamesh and Noah, it's both the flood stories, but with the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods send the flood because human beings are being too loud, right? The gods want to sleep, and we're being too loud, which I relate to more than I have in the past. It's not a God that I would want to worship. Right, the God that I would want to worship, if God is going to send a flood and destroy the earth, I want it to be for moral outrage reasons, right? That evil has filled the world, right? That we have a God who responds, who is outraged by our behavior. That to me is better than God is cranky, who wants to sleep.
One of the things that always seems troubling about this to me, and I guess this is magic is in the eye of the beholder, but you know, we're constantly taught and told, you know, you're not to suffer a witch to
Right,
to live. There's no magic in Judaism. We're
Right.
not about magic. If God makes a miracle,
right,
God makes a miracle, but we don't manipulate God with magic.
right.
And we're not exactly manipulating God with magic here, but it seems very magical.
It says the spell,
Yeah.
right? So it's interesting because our Torah says not to engage in witchcraft or magic, but it doesn't say it doesn't exist. So we see with the Egyptians that the magicians are able to, and you can say, oh, are they just sleight of hand, good at, like.
And some of the stuff in the Talmud Bavli, I think in particular, that where rabbis
They're demons.
accomplish something somehow or have are worthy of a miracle and that,
Yes.
et cetera and
And
so
God
forth,
does it,
also
or creates
seems
potency in it. Yeah,
vaguely like some of the Persian magic all around them.
right, and Ron was saying in Samuel where they go to the woman of
witch of
Endor
Endor.
who brings Saul back from the dead. Who brings Samuel back from the dead.
Which we're explicitly told, don't go to necromancers.
Right. Right. So it doesn't, the Torah doesn't actually say that these things aren't real. It says that we're not meant to engage with them because it would lead to our going astray from God or engaging in idolatrous avodah zarah, idol worship practices. Go ahead. No.
Doesn't say
I'm not the first person to say that, but it seems to me the Sota ritual was designed to let the woman go free.
Yeah.
And to assure the husband, she's fine, go back and make peace in the home.
Good. So that is hitting it right on the head in terms of the direction we're heading in. But right, because it's one of these unfortunate realities. And it's being acknowledged here of like, what do you do with jealousy? Right. And in particular, I think it's sort of saying that men are more susceptible to, and we could debate that, but I think here it's saying that it once sort of burrows into, that little worm, that it'll only fester and grow. And so we need some kind of ritual to just stamp it out, because otherwise it'll turn into a all-consuming fire.
Yeah, what stands out to me is water and the significance of water. I grew up in a town in upstate New York where very religious people would come to be healed in water. And you can be born in water, die in water. Al Nitiel Asiyadayim, would you speak about that a little bit? Water and the various rituals associated with it.
Right. Mikvah, right, water is crucial, but actually the water piece of this is what I want to focus in on. So I'm going to combine your 2 points, Shalom Bait, which is what Nelson's talking about, creating peace in the home, and what's going on with the water in this ritual. So let's move on. So one thing that's interesting about the water is that you are erasing God's name with it, which you'd think, why is God telling us to do that, right? We can't do that. If God's, when I give you these sources, I always make sure that God's name isn't on it, that instead there's a hey and a chupchik or, the 2 yuds, but not God's name, because we don't want to desecrate or dishonor God's name, right? But here, God is giving us a ritual where we're actually supposed to write a curse, which would have God's name in it.
It just says right here, it is one of God's names.
Yeah. So you caught me. Yeah.
I caught you.
But it's an okay one. It's an okay one. But right. So God is telling us to erase God's name in the water. Why would we be told to desecrate God's name? So let's go with the Maharal. This is a 16th century from Prague, scholar and mystic. We would like to read his commentary. Go for it. Thanks.
The Torah permitted the blotting out of God's name here because by doing so, one ensures that harmony will once again reign between husband and wife. When there is harmony between the husband and wife, the Shekhinah dwells among them.
So God's imminent presence. Yeah.
And this action does not lead to the Shekhinahs being pushed away, but to the contrary. The bringing down of the Shekhinah and Shalom, peace, is one of God's names. Indeed, not only is that not considered to be the blotting out of God's name, but it's considered another combination of God's blessed name. Blessed name.
Jesus says how we find excuses. Yes.
Also bringing it more and things
Right.
like that. We were able to.
Loopholes. But I think it's brilliant that God is saying, yes, you're erasing one name, but you are writing another, which is peace. Right? You can erase my name for the sake of creating peace between spouses, which God values and wants, and even to the point of erasing my name, because in erasing one, you are creating another, writing another, which is peace. Shalom, shalom bayit.
It's a nice thing, what I was saying, because what God is saying is we don't be so dogmatic. If it's something that is really
Nice.
best
Yeah,
for humans,
right.
then we have to find a way out of it.
Yes.
Perhaps
Exactly right.
another way of understanding it is don't blot out my name, except when I tell you to for a specific
Right.
reason. And that's about peace in the home.
Right.
So that says that God values peace in the home almost more than God's own ineffable name.
Now, hold on to that, because we're gonna end on that point with somebody else who does the same sort of self-sacrifice for the sake of peace between our.
I don't understand how there can be peace in the house after the husband accuses the wife.
Right. Right.
I don't know how this would ever create peace again.
Right. Practically speaking, you just objected your wife to a humiliating public ritual. It's not gonna be good at home.
No. Does is there any connection that God's, after blotting out his name, then the Shekhinah dwells, which I know some interpretations are that the Shekhinah is the more feminine
Yes.
side of God. So I'm wondering if there's significant in this case that he's almost siding with the woman because his more feminine side
I love that.
is dwelling over the house.
I love that, right?
I don't-
Why the Shekhinah that has to be, Nina's saying that has to be significant. Maybe it's because that represents God's feminine aspect, so maybe it's sort of God's way of citing the woman here. I love that. I also think Kabbalistically, the mystics say that when you do a mitzvah, it is helping to reunite Shekhinah, which is God's feminine aspect, with God's male aspect. And it is sexual in nature. That's sort of the Kabbalistic can get very erratic. It's what, but you're reuniting sort of a strain. And also that sounds polytheistic because you're what God is male, God is female, God is being reunited with it, but that's Kabbalah for you. But it's making me think that there's also a reunion between God's male and female aspects. So that peaceful reunion is also making me so if you're doing something that will try to affect a peaceful reunion down here, it affects a peaceful reunion up there. I think that's Kabbalistic.
And isn't that the goal of marriage is shalom bayis anyway? So
Yeah,
it's interesting, the connections.
right.
It's also, to get back to Ron's point though, without dismissing it, what does that say about the evolution of the place of woman in the community or in society in general? If somehow a humiliating ritual, at least humiliating for the woman, is somehow going to result in shalom bayit.
Right. No, exactly. I think there's a sad reality of just the power dynamics in this society, right? And then we're not meant to stay in
And
that
you've even
place.
said that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai does away with it, not by saying we value women
Right,
as human beings more now, so this ritual doesn't make sense any longer, but just by saying you're all adulterers anyway, so.
right. Yeah, no, exactly right. It would have been nice, right? Like, you know, and there's a takana of Rabbeinu Gershom who outlaws polygamy, right? Because our patriarchs had multiple wives, like there are plenty of examples.
Yeah.
And yet,
The double standard. just-
right. So the Torah doesn't ever outlaw it per se, right? But a rabbi comes along one day and says, takana, which is like a decree, sort of like it's sort of the nuclear option, saying like, I'm just stamping it and saying no more.
The rabbi. But when did in practice stop? The moment?
It's a good question. I think it had stopped well before he made the takana, because I kind of think that society can change the law based on its behavior. If they're not, you know, law can form in a couple ways, top down, here it is, or bottom up. And I think that was an example of it, sort of, the time was right because people had stopped.
There's
I'm
a
not sure that
social history suggestion that it was probably relatively rare anyway because it was expensive. And that over time with an increase in population, it would have been rarer and rarer because it was expensive.
Yeah.
So that it disappeared as a practical matter, except among theoretically the very wealthy. And then perhaps a reason for such a decree is that we're supposed to stamp out arrogance in some sense. It's a sort of arrogance to put your wives like jewels around your neck. Look, I can do this and you can't.
Right. Yeah. No, but I want to acknowledge that it is a humiliating thing to put the woman through. And I'm very glad that our tradition ultimately outlawed it when it did, whatever the motivation was. And who knows, the public motivation might not always be the internal motivation for something. It may just be strategically how to get something passed, but.
And I only have a few thin threads of sources for that. So.
Hey, you came from the TV.
Is there any connection to the wayward son?
Yeah.
Because, well, what's it, stoning or whatever, putting the
Right.
son asunder. That was more a warning or a curse so heinous that you could
Yeah.
never do it. And
yeah.
in this case too, I mean, is there any
Yes, I think
connection to that?
I think it is more of a deterrent. To go back to the point, like how often was this actually done? I'm not sure. I don't know how often, if it was done at all. But I think as a deterrent, same thing with the idea of the spell, right? Going back to the magic component here, like what are we doing dealing with magic? There was some commentary that was saying, it's not so much that the spell was effective, it's more that if you believed that it's sort of a placebo effect, right? Like it's more the deterrent nature of it. The spell is less effective as actually the concern that you'll be liable through this ritual.
That a woman would look elsewhere for love and caring, is a bad reflection on her husband.
Right.
I mean, if he's that bad and she has to look elsewhere, maybe the trouble is with him.
Right, good. So that's where we're getting, that's the last source I included. So I'll just jump the gun and say that we're gonna go there at the end with a source that if you've been to the lunch and learn we did together, Ron is on me for repeating source because you taught this one already, I try to give new angles to it.
But he's paying attention.
Yes, that's good, that's good. But I want to say,
He does that.
right. It's true, Deuteronomy is a repetition, right? You're gonna tell God.
It's okay.
Right, but funny, but no, criticism always.
I didn't say anything until you did it the third time.
I did a lot,
Things are in the Torah more than.
That's true. But at the end, I want to talk about the limits of Shalom Bayit. At what point, right? Obviously, God is saying, I so value Shalom Bayit that I will erase my name for it. But at what point is it like the last straw and we're not meant to just create domestic peace when there is an actual sincere problem at home and the marriage should be dissolved and the wife should be free of a relationship that's not right? We don't want to impose Shalom Bayit if it means perpetuating a toxic situation. So let's move on to the next, but that's where we're headed. Let's go. Who wants to now? The Babylonian Talmud gets all of the glory. But there is, and Shalmi, there's a Jerusalem Talmud. Who wants to read this from Sota, a tractate with the name of the ritual? Go ahead.
Jerusalem Talmud Sota. Rabbi Meir would teach a lesson in the synagogue of Hamata every night of the week. There was a woman who would come regularly to hear him. One time, the lesson lasted longer than usual. When she returned home, she found that the lights had burned out. Her husband said to her, "Where have you been?" "I was listening to the lesson." He said, "May God do so and so if this woman enters his house before spitting in the face of the one who gave that lesson." Rabbi Meir perceived with the help of the Holy Spirit what had happened. He pretended to have a pain in his eye. He announced, "Any woman who knows how to recite a charm over an eye, let her come and heal mine." The woman's neighbors said to her, "The time has come for you to return home. Pretend to be a charmer and spit in his eye." Good idea. She came to him. He said to her, "Do you know how to heal a sick eye through making a charm?" She was scared and replied, "No." He said, "Doesn't it help to spit in the eye 7 times to heal it?" After she spit in his eye, he told her, "Go and tell your husband that although he only asked you to spit once, you in fact spit 7 times. The disciples of Rabbi Meir objected. "You condone this disgraceful behavior toward the Torah? If you had told us about the incident with her husband, we could easily have found him, flogged him at the stake until he was reconciled with his wife." Rabbi Meir responded, "Should the honor of Meir not be equal to that of his creator?" According to Torah, the name of God, which is written in holiness, is to be blotted out in order to bring about peace between a man and a woman. So too, the honor of Meir.
So it's a big deal. There's a status is, when you read rabbinic literature, status is really important, and respect for the rabbis equals respect for Torah, right? Rabbis are vehicles of Torah. And the more learned they are, the more Torah they contain, which is why there's a tradition of students and disciples standing up when a rabbi enters the room. I know with teachers in classroom, that used to be a thing as well. And it's not anymore now. Some students call their teachers by their first name,
Oh.
the whole thing. But right, so to spit in the eye of Rabbi Meir, who is one of the greats, is a total desecration, not only of Meir's name, but of Torah. So the disciples object, saying, we would have just flogged the guy, right? There sort of is this interesting mafioso element, but it's meant to get around the ways in which men contain the power in a marriage back then, right? Because if you have a aguna, an anchored woman, who there's a husband who refuses to give a
Baseball
get.
bat solution.
Right, that, because only the male can initiate the divorce, the religious divorce. There are ways around it in Orthodoxy where basically they come with crowbars, right? And compel them
Baseball.
to give their baseball bat, right? To give again. In the conservative movement, we do around it much more peacefully, and we write a paragraph into the ketubah that says if a divorce, if the marriage is going to be dissolved and the husband refuses to give a get, then the marriage is annulled retroactively. So it's a much more peaceful solution to free the woman who wants the divorce if the husband does not, if he refuses, the recalcitrant husband refuses to give it.
There's a divorce Italian style. It's a movie years ago. And
Right.
you know how that one ended.
I'm sure. Right, but so here is sort of the Orthodox way of doing it, which is we'll compel him to let her back in. But Mayor's saying, I'm gonna do it this way, which is the self-sacrificial way, because if God is willing to erase God's name, who am I to have too much pride to not, allow her to spit in my face in order to make peace between husband and wife? This doesn't do much to address our concerns that will there actually be peace in the home after this? Or is this just, on the surface, okay, you solved the technical issue, but there's a much more deeper underlying conflict between the spouses here, and do they really have peace? Those are great questions that I think are sort of not addressed here. But certainly the point being that we're meant to so value shalom bayit, creating peace in the home, even to the point of self-sacrifice, desecrating your name, desecrating God's name, because shalom is also God's name. So you're doing it for the sake of another one of God's names. So it comes out in the wash.
Another thing that I think maybe is interesting, unless you tell me it does work out this way. We have other cases where the rabbis say this never happened, like the recalcitrant son. It's there as an example, but there are so many strictures that would have to be overcome for it to actually happen. It basically never happened.
Yeah.
They don't seem to say that about this.
Right.
Uh,
But we know that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai gets rid of it. So you're right. There's not the same sort of rabbis limiting it out of existence the way they do with the Ben Sura Moray, the wayward and rebellious son. They say it must be a son, not a daughter. They say it has to be wayward and rebellious. They say that, there have to be X amount of witnesses. There's,
the mother and the father have to say exactly the same thing.
Until basically they say, okay, well then, if God never wanted you to do it, why did God put it in the Torah to begin with? And their answer is because God wanted us to do this process of deep investigation and learning. Because this process was a bunch of Torah study, and that's what God wants. So you might not buy that and say, but there's a beauty to it, saying that actually, and this goes back to Shavuot and the idea of revelation. Is it just something that is passively received, or is it something that's actively engaged with? And God wants that human participation. But yes, I don't think there's a similar kind of limiting sota out of existence. So there's a whole tractate of Talmud dedicated to sota, but we know that ultimately there's a takana that gets rid of it. So yes, no.
I'm Barry Epstein. So I think in Judaism, we believe that how you act is even more important than how you think, what you think.
Right.
So by pushing reconciliation, even though we don't know exactly how the husband and wife are thinking about each other, maybe if they do get back together again and they spend time together again, they will remember what they liked about each other before.
Yeah, very, I think that's great. And, I think of Fiddler on the Roof with Do You Love Me, right? It's sort of not the primary concern, what you think about one another, right? It's more important tradition and mitzvot and being able to raise a family and sort of doing what you're meant to do as Jews, which is sad. That's not to say that Judaism is not about romance. And we see romance in the way that, Jacob labored 7 years and then another 7 for Rachel and Leah, but it was like a passing day because of how much he loved her. And the way that Rebecca falls off the horse when she sees Isaac and puts a veil on her, there are, and Song of Songs, Shir Shirim, which made it into the canon because, and it's just this erotic love poetry. So I don't mean to say that there is no romance in Judaism. We do. We certainly have a rich tradition of it. But there is also this sort of like, well, it's secondary to chiyuv, to obligation. What are the mitzvot? What do we need to do? And so maybe the feelings will follow, right? That's what she said. That's her response, right? For how many years? 25 years. If that's not love, what is, right? I'm doing love. I am doing love, right? Is that not, what feelings? What's irrelevant?
And look what David did to get Bathsheba.
Right. Right. But yeah, so but I like the idea of, well, maybe the feelings follow. And I think that a lot about with Shabbat, where if somebody says, just why should I do Shabbat? It doesn't make any sense to me. Na'aseh v'nishma, right? That's how we respond. Going back to Shavuot and Revelation, the Jewish people respond to God's offering of the commandments by saying Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do it and we will learn it. You'd think it'd be reversed. First, we'll read the terms of the contract and then we'll decide if we want to sign off. They go, we'll sign it and then we'll learn it. Meaning that we'll do it first and see how it feels with Shabbat, and then you'll understand it. Okay, go ahead, Sheila.
It's really more practical when you think about it, and you're more willing to follow it. You're not bound by the rule. You don't think of the rules so much. You think of the enjoyment, and then you go, oh my God, I did this wrong, I did that wrong.
Right.
But by that time, you're supposed to be so engrossed in it
Yes.
that, you don't notice.
Right. Sometimes you just have to experience something first in order to understand the appeal. And then you can sort of tolerate the fact that the rules are hard. Experiential education. Exactly right. Yeah.
So knowing the rules and following them may seem like restrictions, but in a way, doesn't that allow one to feel more free and appreciate what you can do and what you can't do and when you can do it and when you can't do it?
Yeah.
Laws of Nida and so forth.
Yeah. Well, the metaphor I like with that is a musical, like a key signature, right? Because that's a lot of rules, right? You have to know the theory before you sit down at a piano and play. But once you know the rules, once you know the key signature, then you're free to actually create beautiful music, which is actually, so the rules are more freeing than no rules at all. Because if you just sit there and, you're not really creating anything at all. So there's creative potential to rules and there is freedom with constriction. It's a paradox, but it plays out. Okay, so I want us now to move on to an interesting, so somebody asked, has Sota ever actually been done? I'm gonna argue that there is an example of Sota being done in Exodus. And it's Moses who does it. And I did give a sermon about this, so I'm anticipating your. But who wants to read? This is right after the golden calf, right? Moses is getting the 10 Commandments, getting Torah. Meanwhile, the children of Israel have built a golden calf because they think Moses is dead. We need to move on. We need a physical manifestation of God. They go to Aaron, build us a golden calf that he does. And then Moses comes down and sees what they've done. And then here's how Moses responds. Who wants to read? Exodus 32. Go ahead. Thanks, Nathan.
He took the calf that they had made and burned it, ground it to powder, and strewed it upon the water, and made the Israelites drink. Moses went back to God and said, alas, this people is guilty of a great sin in making for themselves a god of gold. Now, if you will forgive their sin, well and good, but if not, erase me from your book.
So it's parallels. Number one, the obvious one, grounding the idol into powder, putting it, strewing it upon the water, making them drink.
Yep.
That's the most blatant, right? But then, and so obviously, the other thing about Sinai is that it's a marriage, right? The rabbis say that that was the chuppah, that was the wedding canopy between God and the people of Israel. So what were the commandments? It was the ketubah, right? Our ketubah, our marriage contract between God and us. And when Moses comes down, people have gone astray after the golden calf, that's the adultery. What does Moses do with the tablets?
Smashes
it.
Smashes them, basically ripping up the marriage contract. Here's what you've done. You violated the terms of our ketubah, and then goes back up. And by the way, Moses is wearing a veil because his face is so, there's a lot of marriage imagery there, but we've cheated on God. Moses has us do the Sota ritual and then says to God, if you forgive us, if there will be shalom between us, between husband and wife here, great. But if not, what does he say?
Erase me.
Erase my name from your book. Just like God's name is erased in the Sota ritual, Moses is saying, erase my name, just like Rabbi Meir says, spit in my eye for the sake of peace. Moses is saying, erase me
He sacrifices
for
himself.
peace.
Can I,
Go ahead,
But
Barry.
then they have to think about.
Yes, I want to get to, but I just call him Barry, but then I'll get to Sheila, yeah.
So this is the second piece that we're reading about drinking polluted water.
Yes.
Rabbis, I'm sure there must be some discussion about the meaning of drinking polluted water and how it keeps appearing.
It's a great question and something that I'm definitely really interested in because I'm passionate about, environmentalism. So I would love more at my fingertips in terms of specifically polluted water in our tradition. I'd have to think, there's the Nile turning to blood. Right, that's the obvious one. But I'd have to think about other examples. There's the flood, but that's not,
Jonah and the whale is.
yeah, water is certainly very significant, but specifically polluted water, or, there are examples of air pollution, right? I think it's Bava Metzia, maybe Bava, one of the Bavas in the Talmud, but it talks about damages that are caused between neighbors through the air, like if you are tilling your garden or what, and dust is being kicked up into the air and it's causing damage to your neighbor. But the question is like, are you doing it? You're not doing anything wrong. You're dealing with your own property, but the air is shared. And so what you're doing impacts your neighbor, and there is actually responsibility in that. So that is the closest thing I could think of at my fingertips in terms of like polluting a shared resource. But I don't know. Go ahead.
If you're gonna pollute that same shared resource, you're doing the same thing when you send the lepers to cleanse themselves in the water.
Oh, sure.
In other words, they're taking their germs,
Right.
putting it into the water.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's interesting. And there's the king who's healed by going into the Jordan, and I could have gone into the river in my own home. Why are you making me go to the Jordan? There's nothing special about the Jordan,
Yeah.
but then he ultimately does it and is healed. Yeah, so that is interesting. And I wonder if they had an awareness of like germ theory. The whole leprosy thing makes you think, oh my God, how insightful that before germ theory, our rabbis not our rabbis, our tradition, our Torah acknowledges that there is like quarantine
yeah,
and
because
things that
the
are,
priests actually,
right,
they're not rabbis per se, it's the priests.
right, exactly, right, it's before the rabbis, but.
I have another,
Right, we wash our hands, so there seems to be a real consciousness of it, yes, for sure. But I don't know if they knew the extent to which like.
well, because
bathing would-
it's possible that it's coincidental because the concern is for ritual purity in a sense, so that you're using water in a way that's actually physically good as well as maybe spiritually good.
Yeah,
The other thing I wanted to bring in with this, because it seems to fit in with this whole theme of jealousy, is that very word or whatever word we're translating, because I think in in Eitz Chaim, it's translated as impassioned or something of that sort, but God describes God's self as impassioned.
Right.
And it's usually translated in older translations as jealous.
Yeah.
Which seems to be in the sense of, only me, there are no other gods.
Right.
But I mean, the explicit commandment here is no representations.
Right.
And, Moses has gone from the point of view of the people a very long time, and maybe he's dead because he's been gone so long. From Moses's point of view, and especially maybe God's point of view, he hasn't gone that long.
Right.
But already they're making a representation.
Right.
And maybe that's a critical thing because I think they would have said, we're not denying God, we're just making a representation, because everybody does that.
Right.
And we're just doing what human beings do.
Right.
But God is saying, no, you're doing something different now. And already only 40 days, you went back to that when I explicitly told you not to.
Right. Yeah, no, it's very, they scholars think that what they were actually doing in creating a golden calf was like building God's throne, because God would be sitting on the throne. So it's not actually just trying to depict God so much as like God's throne, but regardless, it is a physical molten image.
And that's a nice thing for scholars to say, but you still have to get around that they say, this is your God, Israel.
Yeah. God is in plural, right?
What's
That's-
interesting about sitting on the golden calf is it turns out that later he sits on the two cherubim,
Right, that God appears from between.
also made from gold.
Right.
And we just read all this stuff about,
Well, I
we
think.
just read all this throne imagery stuff on Shavuot in the Haftarah.
Right,
So, which is apparently fairly typical, this sort of throne imagery.
right.
Yeah.
Because we're human beings and we experience the world through a certain lens and filter, and God knows that. God knows God's creation. And that's Maimonides' whole thing about God speaks in metaphor. Whenever it says God's mighty hand and outstretched arm, God doesn't have a hand or an arm, but we need that to understand because, we're limited and we need those tools, those literary tools. So same thing with, I think, with the throne and king and sitting on Antikyomim, which is Daniel, the vision of God with truly like long, white flowing hair, sort of like the cartoony image of God in the sky. It's not that we actually believe that that's what God is, but these are helpful devices.
So maybe weirdly, that's what Sir Christopher Wren was saying on his epitaph when he said, if you need a monument, look around you, and it's St. Paul's Cathedral.
Right, yeah.
Weird.
I have a whole bunch of points. Let me apologize. One thing we're not supposed to do is choose one mitzvah over another.
Mhm.
They're equally important as far as we can tell. And therefore, if we blot out God's name but replace it with a different name, we're not really blotting out God's name, we're just doing a different mitzvah. And it's perfectly fine. That's, I think, where the rabbis wind up.
No doubt, yeah.
With mitzvahs. And that's another way of thinking about names. I got more, I should have notes.
It's hard, actually. Well, it's interesting because I would push back a little bit. On one hand, yes, like it's hard to have mitzvot compete with each other, right? If you're doing a mitzvah, you're doing a mitzvah. Oops, I just did an Avera. Sorry, but I actually do think that there's like a scale. Not that everything can be objectively qualified, but I like when I think of the Ubara Shehericha, the pregnant woman who smells cooked dish on Yom Kippur. Sins have a scale and degrees, right?
Yeah.
They say, well, don't just let her eat. You do need to feed her because saving a life comes before, but give her some juice first, see if the juice works. If the juice doesn't work, then you can give her actual, like the meat of it, but it's incremental. So I think the same is true of mitzvot, that there are others that are considered higher than, like, I don't think they're all, but I agree that there are no small mitzvot. I don't think any are small, but I do think there are some that would be considered.
Yeah.
I know, you're not allowed to kill.
Yeah.
I mean, to save your life.
Right,
But you're certainly allowed to violate the Shabbat to save someone else's life.
right.
And the rabbi, as I understand it, if you're gonna do something that's seemingly out of line, you should do it in a special kind of way, so you know it's different.
Mhm.
So that you, in your own thought, you marked it.
Right, she knew it's different, yeah, exactly. Right, and the no killing to save your life is, the exception is self-defense. And even that, it depends, is it night or day? Like if somebody's trying to break into your house, if it's during the day,
Yeah.
you're not supposed to kill them, that's blood guilt, because the assumption is if they're robbing you during the day, and that's not true in every case, of course, but that they're not actually bent on killing you because there would be witnesses, people would be around and hear it. But at night, you can assume that the intention is lethal, and so if you kill them, it's pure self-defense and there's no blood guilt on you for doing so. But certainly you can't kill somebody innocent to save your, that's the reg valia for it. A king comes to you and says, kill so-and-so or I'll kill you. You can't kill so-and-so and justify it because you were saving their life. But I want to end with this one final piece, which is sort of addressing the question of, okay, we've made the case for Shalom Bayit, how important it is. Rebbe Meir, Moses, God, all are willing to erase their own names in different ways in order to create peace between spouses. So that's a very, very high important value. But when is it beyond the pale? Like when does it just need to dissolve? When is it a mitzvah to not try to maintain peace in the home, but allow, the spouses to part ways? So this is from our Talmud from Ketubot, wedding contracts, right? Does anyone want to read?
I'll take my guilt.
You go ahead, go for it.
As it is told of Rav Ruhumi, who would commonly study before Rava and Mahotza, he used to come back to his home every year on the eve of Yom Kippur.
By the way, I'll just pause. That's important because anybody remember? What's the significance of, he would come, before this, there's a context of how often do spouses need to be intimate? Or at least offer intimacy? Like, I'll rephrase the question as, how long can a spouse withhold intimacy from their spouse? Meaning if they're away on work, if they're out at sea, if they're, how often are they obligated to return home in order to offer intimacy to their spouse? So now that's the context for this. He was not a sailor, but he would study. He was away all year. He'd be so engrossed in his study. And he would come home once a year. And it was Yom Kippur, which means what?
You can't.
You can't.
Exactly. So go ahead, keep reading.
I'm away from home now for 1 week. I'll be away for 2 weeks, so my wife is, anyway. She hopes
Too much information.
Today he was particularly engrossed in his studies and did not go home. His wife was expecting him that day and kept telling herself, now he's coming. In the end, he did not come. She was distressed by this and a tear fell from her eye. At that exact moment, Rav Ruhumi was sitting in the roof collapsed under him and he died.
Well, I might want to go back to Elliot's point about water and say that the tear here maybe is some sort of water or sota connection, but regardless, it's not that he's being unfaithful unless you say Torah is the alluring mistress. And honestly, going back to Kabbalah, the Zohar does that all the time. The Torah is sort of this alluring, mysterious, feminine figure that it's a rod, it flashes you within moments of insights, but then is concealed again and you're confounded.
They're so absorbed in what they're doing,
Right.
they forget they have a family.
Well, that's exactly what's happened here. So huh?
Yeah,
Work. And that's exactly the context of this conversation. To what extent can you allow work to take you away from home,
Sure.
right? And
And there was
There-
this
go ahead.
saying that, do not make a woman cry, for God counts her tears.
oh, I love that. That's great. Yeah. And hell hath no fury, right? But he's studying, yeah, he's on the roof, which was a common place to study. There were flat roofs. So he's studying on the roof. And she cries back at home and the roof that he's sitting on collapses and he dies. But I think that is a metaphor for the house collapsing. Right? At some point, Shalom Bayit is no longer the ideal because
The marriage has collapsed.
the marriage has collapsed and it's actually a mitzvah or a duty to move on so that each partner can have a, fulfilling,
She's a widow.
healthy
She can
life.
move on.
Go ahead.
Yes, exactly. If she's a widow, she can move on.
Not happy, right? She's miserable and the tears she said. But I didn't want to have a whole conversation about Shalom Bayit without bringing balance to say that our tradition acknowledges that it's not meant to be forcing shalom into a marriage that is beyond saving. Go ahead.
Is in the Talmud, isn't it the maximum 6 months that the husband can be away?
I think so, but it does depend on, so you're saying like that. I don't know,
It's a sailor.
it's for a sailor, yeah, I think it's for a sailor, but I'd have to go back and see but that's about it, right, it wants couples, it wants Shalom Bayit, so it's not gonna give you too much time, but it acknowledges the realities of the world, especially back then, right? It's, less connected, right, and just the realities of travel back then
And we had, you brought this up way back on one of the early Thursday classes. But strikes me, and I'm not sure I thought about it then, that there's a tragedy in this because I don't think she's crying her tear because she feels trapped in her marriage. It feels like she's crying her tear because he's not there and where is he? What's happened to him?
He loves.
So
Yeah.
ironically, she's freed from a guy who's ironically valuing Torah maybe more than her. And maybe the rabbis are, as you said, making a statement just from that
Right.
in this story. But there's a tragic irony in it.
Right. And you might say, because there are examples, we talked about this before too, that there was a rabbi who just loved Torah so much that he never married, and that was okay. Because osek b'mitzvah, hatur min mitzvah. If you are busy, this is kind of what Nelson was saying about, if you're busy doing a mitzvah, then you're exempt from other mitzvot. So in that case, it was okay, right? Even though our tradition really encourages a family life, but if you're busy doing mitzvot, like you're good, you don't need to fulfill that one. But here, we get all these examples with Sota where Torah is diminished for the sake of Shalom Bayit, that God is valuing, to a sense, family life even above Torah. Because Rabbi Meir says, spit in my eye, because Moses says, erase me from my book, because God says literally, take the writing with my name on it and erase it in order to create peace in the home. So if you have somebody who is married, but spending more time with Torah than his wife, that is counter to what God has done here by saying, erase me for the sake of, right? So this is the opposite, which is no, Torah over Shalom. And we're saying, no, you can actually diminish Torah for the sake of Shalom. And that's not what he's doing here. So he's doing the counter of
And don't we have other examples? I can't think of one offhand where somebody says, look at me, I'm doing Torah. And somebody else says, if you were actually doing Torah, wouldn't you be not ignoring your family or doing
right,
something more?
right. Because what's
How do
holier than
you
that?
balance?
Right, because this too is Torah, right? That Torah isn't just sitting and studying, right? Torah is how you live. Torah is the relationships in your life.
What's the
So you
point
can't
of
neglect that Torah.
perpetuating Torah if you have no one to perpetuate it to?
That's great. If it just stays in your own mind and it's not shared. Yeah. So thank you, everybody, for engaging in Torah studies.